the unspeakable things that happened at the Nanjing Massacre. Kill all, burn all, loot all. This was the motto of the Japanese forces as they penetrated the Chinese mainland during the Second Sino-Japanese War, and the massacre at Nanjing, or the Nanking Massacre as known in the English-speaking world, was the perfect embodiment of their motto. But before we can get to that, let's ask ourselves what can push people to the point that they would commit those atrocities. Imagine if someone was to invade Washington, D.C., massacre somewhere between 50 to 300,000 people, rape anywhere between 20 and 80,000 women, and execute more than 30,000 prisoners of war. This is not a matter of perverse imagination. This happened in the Chinese capital of Nanjing in 1937. China and Japan's love-hate relationship. Most of the mainstream media in the West wrongly clumps Chinese, Korean, and Japanese cultures together. In reality, all these cultures have distinct cultures, histories, and relationships with one another, and this story involves some of those differences. The First Sino-Japanese War was a war between the Chinese and the Japanese over the control of Taiwan and the Kingdom of Joseon, or what we now call Korea. After Joseon's empress was assassinated, the kingdom switched its name to Korea. Anyway, as the Japanese influence increased with their victory in the war, so did their ambitions. China, on the other hand, was declining. Different factions, governments, and foreign powers were fighting to gain the upper hand. The Kuomintang's corrupt and inept government controlled the western portion of the country, whereas rebels and warlords maintained control in the east. The Americans, British, French, the Russians, and the Germans also had spheres of influence inside the region. In the early 20th century, Japan emerged victorious in the Russo-Japanese War and further extended control over some Chinese territories, including Taiwan. Japan had long had territorial disputes with China, and the two, situated next to each other, were clear economic rivals. But the most important thing was, perhaps, the prevalent nationalism on the Japanese side. We asked in the beginning how someone could kill, rape, and execute innocent people without any regrets, and for that, we need to understand the Japanese mindset at the time. On the top of the world, Japan had closed off its borders to Western nations for 200 years before the Meiji Restoration. The Restoration was a period of growth and progress that turned into a wave of nationalism. The local population perceived themselves to be technologically, economically, and militarily better equipped than other Asian and Western powers. These beliefs took root at a base level, as some officials utilized Confucianism and folk beliefs to engender nationalist sentiment. Then there was social Darwinism. The eugenics movement in the US is often considered its worst form, but in Japan, these ideas of racial and ethnic superiority were much more widespread. Japanese leaders and intellectuals reinforced the idea that nations, like organisms, compete for survival. This meant that the average Joe in the military had no issues with colonializing other nations and states. Leaving the ideological indoctrination aside for a minute, the civilian population was also sheltered from the horrific crimes. Since the Japanese military had unrestricted power in the early 20th century, they were able to restrict the flow of information through their hierarchical censorship. It does make sense that the Japanese would go to war against the Chinese and Russians, but that was not enough. They would go on to annex Korea and send troops to anti-Bolshevik forces in Siberia. But most importantly, they would force China to sign 21 demands during the First World War that challenged China's sovereignty by demanding more political and economic control over its territories. Fast forward to 1931, and Japan was still on a high they would not come down from until their surrender at the end of the Second World War. But we digress. It's 1931, and this is where the Japanese forces decided to finally make their mark. They provoked an incident in Manchuria to take over the territory's rich natural resources. fueling the Manchurian fire. By 1937, the Japanese were hungry for some more, so another controversial incident in Manchuria led to an invasion of mainland China. The Japanese made their way through one settlement after another, clearing out one city and then another. Near the end of the year, they were standing outside the Chinese capital of Nanjing. Some of the local Chinese population had already skipped town. The Japanese forces lurked in the shadows, roaming in the outskirts. They waited for the opportune moment to strike. When the battle finally began on December 1st, 1937, they were able to mete out punishment to the feeble Chinese resistance. It took them a day or two to wrestle the city from the hands of the Chinese military. The Chinese soldiers were quick to run for their lives. Some even shot their compatriots to clear the roads so they could run through more easily. They knew what the Japanese war machine was capable of. They knew the hell that awaited those who remained in the city. It was a fate worse than death. When General Matsui Hiwani led Japanese troops into the city on December 13th, the massacre began. The 6-week massacre and horrific accounts. The Japanese had their way with members of the Chinese civilian and military population that remained isolated in the city. They drank themselves silly and let their hedonistic get the best of them. For soldiers who already believed themselves to be racially superior to the imprisoned people, nothing was beyond reproach. Different demographics were spread out into different areas of the city. If anyone tried to escape during this restructuring, no problem. The machine gunners on the city boundaries were happy to plow down anyone who dared come their way. Piles of bodies would be left to rot in the open air. Meanwhile, soldiers in the inner city competed with each other in different ways. Some bet on how many Chinese they could kill with their trucks. Others challenged each other to see who could lop off the most heads with their samurai swords. In the heat of things, bayonets had to fill in for the prestigious swords, and line after line of Chinese locals were sheared down. Pregnant women and babies were not exempt. Those who died quickly had it better in a way. For those that remained standing, things were much less civil. The Japanese tortured men, women, and children. They inserted needles in their victims' eyes, cut off noses, and set piles of them on fire with gasoline. From underaged girls to elderly women, anywhere between 20 to 80,000 women were raped, and things did not calm down after 6 weeks. The Japanese occupation of China was filled with events of this kind, but maybe none as potent and shocking as this one. A survivor named Zhu Dewa would later give a testimony explaining how his brother, who was preparing to cross the river to Zhangbei shortly after the Nanjing Massacre, was stabbed by the Japanese soldiers and thrown into the Yangtze River. He also recalls how in February 1938 his neighbor was at home when suddenly 2 Japanese devils came in and raped his sister-in-law. At that time, Chen Shixi went forward to stop them, but was dragged to the frozen unit of the present astronomy factory by Japanese soldiers. They let him kneel down and shot at his head, killing him. Another survivor, Chen Fenying, recalls, "My elder brother, Chen Jingling, and my sister-in-law, Hu, just got married for 2 days. The Japanese soldier chased after my sister-in-law and tried to rape her. My sister-in-law would rather die than be humiliated. As a result, she jumped into a pond in Yanghuao village and drowned, and my elder brother was shot dead by the Japanese soldiers. In addition, I had a cousin sister-in-law surnamed Wang, who was in her 20s and was dragged into a cave by 3 Japanese soldiers and raped and killed." An unlikely hero. While the international response to the Nanjing Massacre was muted and European officials cowered away to stay out of the drunken rage of the Japanese, a Nazi businessman, John Rabe, was trying to save citizens in the city. Venturing out from the German diplomatic safe zone, he and his crew would give shelter to anyone they could find. The best-selling author Iris Chang wrote in her book, The Rape of Nanking, Perhaps the most fascinating character to emerge from the history of the rape of Nanking is the German businessman John Rabe. To most of the Chinese in the city, he was a hero, the living Buddha of Nanking, the legendary head of the international safety zone who saved hundreds of thousands of Chinese lives. The aftermath and legacy. General Matsui and his lieutenant were tried and convicted of war crimes in the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. They were later executed. The death numbers were all over the place. Since the locals were not fond of census due to taxation, most of them were not in official records. Japanese apologists continue to downplay the massacre, claiming that it was not all that bad, whereas the other side tries to exaggerate the figures. The truth, it remains muddy and hard to confront. In 1958, the Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall was built to pay tribute to the victims of the massacre. It is located near a site where thousands of bodies were buried, a site commonly known as the Pit of 10,000 Corpses. If you learned something from this video, like, comment, and subscribe. We hope this controversial topic does not deter you from visiting us again. That's it for now. See you in the next one.